Thank you to all my channel members, including my fan appreciation level members and my contributor level members, for helping support the YouTube channel.
Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have the honor of having Stephen Aryan to talk about his trilogy, The Nightingale and the Falcon. Stephen, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
So we're talking about this trilogy of yours that just published from Angry Robot Books. We have the
Yes.
first book, The Judas Blossom, came out a couple years ago. Then we
hmm
had The Blood Dimmed Tide, and then the reason we're talking is because your third and final book in the trilogy, The Sorrow of the Sea, just released this past month. And
This is
so I
it.
wanted to talk to you about what was the pitch? What is the idea for this trilogy?
Okay. So I fell down a rabbit hole whilst investigating and looking up something online that led me into doing more research on the Mongol Empire. I had watched Marco Polo previously, the TV show that
Hmm.
is good, but there's things that I didn't like about it. And my part of my family history is Persian, and so all of these things kind of coalesced. And I thought I'd like to do historical fantasy, having done epic fantasy, having done a quest-based duology. I thought I wanted to do something different this time, and so writing a story inspired by history, but rather than making it sort of using just the trappings of history. Like I know some people do stories and say, based upon historic elements, but they'll have
Mhm.
griffins and dragons and all these things
Right.
wandering around. And I thought, I don't want to do that. I want it to feel of the period in which it's set, but I don't want to always focus on the court of Kublai Khan. There's lots of stories and TV shows
Hmm.
about that. What's going on in the Middle East? What was going on in Europe and Asia and the rest of the Northern Europe as well, into kind of Caucasus region. So let's focus on that. Let's touch on Persia and talk about what was happening there as the rest of the world struggles with the expanding Mongol Empire. And so all these elements came together, and from that, wanting to play around with that, I did more research, found gaps that I found interesting, and a story started to build.
And you talk about that. It makes it fascinating because, I had to decide where am I going to shelve these books? I could shelve them in my historical fiction section, or I could shelve them in fantasy. And it's
Yeah.
really hard to decide. I decided to shelve them in fantasy because there
Okay.
is some like magic fantasy stuff going on in them. But like
Yes.
it's it's essentially historical fiction down to like I was like looking up, oh, this character is real, maybe from a different time period or
hmm
a little
hmm
bit, but this character is real. This character is real. I was like, wow, there's a lot of history here.
Yes.
So, how did you blend the two genres when with your writing? You talked about not wanting to introduce maybe griffins or too fantastical elements, but how did you
Yeah.
find the balance of what you wanted?
It was quite tricky to get it right. I knew that I was introducing fictional characters, but also having real characters. So the two of them presented some challenges. With
Hmm.
historically accurate characters, I had to flesh them out as best of my knowledge and research and make them feel three-dimensional real people. Even the ones that history obviously says were appalling people, I
Hmm.
still had to make Hulagu Khan feel like a real person
Right.
so the characters was one challenge. Making the era feel it like the 13th century was another challenge.
Hmm.
So that I'd done all of this research, but I'm only showing you the kind of the 20%, like the iceberg. There's 80% under the water that I need so that when I'm telling you the story, if I turn left instead of right, I know where I'm going. I know what the buildings look like. I know what all these sort of elements make sense. So it was a real juggling act between what am I going to introduce that's going to feel new to the reader who haven't probably hasn't read much about this era and this period and this part of the world. They won't know a lot. So what do I leave out on purpose so that they're not constantly stumbling over information? I want
Hmm.
this to be an enjoyable read, an adventure, an exciting, a thrilling story. I don't want them to feel like this is a boring history lesson. It's just full of facts and dates and names, and now I feel like I'm back in the classroom. So it was that was the biggest challenge of this whole thing. Not necessarily the characters and their story arcs, but getting that balance between what am I going to introduce that's real and what am I going to take out from history and find the level where the story's progressing, but people don't read it and go, oh, that doesn't make sense. It was a massive jump then. I don't understand what happened. So it took a lot of trial and error, I think, on the first book. And then once I got it, I'm steering the ship slightly more away from history with each book in the
Yep.
trilogy. The main points in the Judas Blossom, all of the main events are historically accurate.
Hmm.
Who was there, the time period it took, how long some of them took is not as accurate, but
Yep.
I'm kind of hitting all of the points. But I keep pointing to people who get upset about it, saying it does say historical fantasy. So
Yeah.
I'm not trying to write like Connor Golden, who does historical
Right.
fiction,
Yeah.
as close as he can possibly get. Everything, every T is crossed, every I is dotted. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. I'm folding in other elements to make it my own story as much as possible.
Well, this was the first time because I'm a history teacher for high school, and this was the first time I had to teach world history for high school this year. And I was reading this trilogy as I'm having to teach about the Mongols and having to teach about
Fascinating.
this type of stuff. And so it's funny that I'm doing the research for my class while also reading these books. And I just spent the whole time going, I know there's some inaccuracies, but man, my students would love this so much more.
Only if they're
And
old enough to read it, of course, because it's
yeah,
quite
they yeah.
adult.
Yeah, it is quite adult, but my kids would they could have handled it.
Oh, okay,
But
okay.
the you're right that you do have as the trilogy goes on, especially I would say in the third book, there
Yes.
are some major deviations where a few characters showed up and I'm like, okay, I know that character's not from this time
Yep.
period, but
Yep.
it worked in the books because I was just so hooked and I was so excited at one point because I was like, okay, there's this one character who has not shown up yet but is like a major part of Mongolian history and needs to show up. And he does show up in the third book. And that was
Hmm.
exciting, even though it may have been a little bit inaccurate. It was really exciting getting to see that.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so you mentioned at the beginning that you have Persian in your family, and that
Yes.
makes total sense after reading the trilogy because even though it's about the Mongolians, it's
Hmm.
also really about the Persians who are being conquered by the Mongols and them fighting back. And
Yes.
so when you were doing the historical research, how much of it was from Mongolian sources and how much of it was from maybe family sources or from the Persian side?
Almost all of it is Mongolian, really. All of the books that I got from the library or university or online, everything I read is all about the Mongol conquest. It's all about how they changed the world, how much of the world they occupied. You get elements from, you don't get told many perspectives from the people who are actually being conquered. You only find out what happened afterwards. But then again, history is written by the victors, and they
Hmm.
conquered such a large portion of the known world. It was only later that historians were able to look back and reflect on things and say, well, maybe this happened, maybe that happened. There's a famous, I can't remember his name at the moment, but there's a famous Persian scribe who did write a long history of the Mongol Empire. But the translations are hard to find. But there's bits you can find where he talks about some of the characters and some of the elements. And of course, Marco Polo himself, the travels of Marco Polo, talk about it. But there's some things are very light on detail because Princess Kokachin is mentioned in his books because
Hmm.
she travels with him for 2 years, going from Mongolia to Persia to marry the Khan. But there's almost nothing about her in the book. Like, so you don't know anything from her perspective. You don't have any clue what she saw during this adventure of across the world. So that kind of opened doors, and I thought, yeah, there's room and there's scope for me to play around with history without upsetting it too much to begin with, at least.
So you mentioned Kokachin, who is one of, I would say, one of the four main characters. I mean,
Yes,
it's a decent sized cast, but there's really four main characters. You really have Hulagu, you have Kokachin, Kaivon, and Temujin. How did
yes.
you land on making these your four primary POVs?
So I wanted to write from the perspective of someone who'd been conquered from Kayvon, as
Hmm.
Mongols are moving to country, fight the army unless they've already surrendered, like before they were conquered, like Georgia, who just became
Hmm.
a kind of a state essentially, and they retained the throne, but not really. The Persians fought and lost, but so they don't have an army. They don't have any way to fight back, and he's the last general. So I kind of I like that idea of having someone the last of his kind. He's great at doing this thing. He can't do this anymore. he can't wage war in the same way. And there's a bit of a mirror between him and Hulagu because, of course, war is evolving and he's having to adapt as they move from country to country and from terrain to terrain, and they're trying to lay siege to cities. He can't just charge in on his horse. Mongol Empire, everyone talks about the speed and how much they lived off their horses and the power they have, which is all true. But equally, when you come to a massive walled city, horses are now irrelevant. So he has to adapt. So I liked having that from the flip side of Kayvon, thinking, right, well, I have no army. How do I fight back? And he has to learn about his enemy. So he does that. But it's not spoiled. It's kind of the very beginning of the first book by becoming a double agent, essentially. I like the idea of having a son of Hulagu because he had many sons and daughters who did run the empire when he was away, and his wives did too, and they're all kind of titans of industry or great warriors. But I thought, what if there wasn't? What if there's someone who is named after the great Genghis Khan, who's called Temujin, inspired to be something great, and he's a letdown. He's not what anybody wants. He keeps trying things and failing. How would he fit into this very warrior-driven society? If he'd been a woman, a daughter, Hulagu would have just shoved her off to go become a businesswoman or run this or run that, and he tries it and it still doesn't work. So that was quite an interesting juxtaposition. Kokachin, I like the fact that she would essentially become a stranger in a strange land, a woman who's been abandoned in this country because she was just one of many, many wives. And then because often in sort of TV shows and things, you have the person who's introduced who knows nothing is the new recruit. And they're the kind of vehicle through which you can tell and explore the world because everyone has to tell them what's going on.
Right.
And so she was a little bit like that, allowed me for her to move around Persia, to explore the cities, to find out about the culture. So that's also trickling into the reader. And then having Hulagu himself as a character, I think, was important. Some people have said, why are you having essentially a point of view from what they're calling the villain? And I thought, well, he's an awful person, history teaches us, but equally, he was still a human being. And if we don't see the kind of macro story with him and his brothers, effects later on, that part of history, the Civil War, the infighting, all the other things, won't make as much sense. So we need to have all the different levels. And this kind of gave me a new perspective. The fifth kind of perspective of the 12 trickled in
Oh, the 12, yeah.
gradually when I was working on it. Things started coming together and I thought, I need something else. And I wrote one chapter and later on I thought, oh, I need someone slightly different or a slightly different chapter on the 12 and a different character. And so they built up gradually, but the first four were there from the beginning before I actually started writing chapter one, really.
Well, including Hulagu makes total sense to me because he's an excellent POV because he seems so smart and he's so powerful and everyone's reacting to things he does as well. But I also just really liked the way, especially the second book was structured because at one point in the second book, all of our main characters want to kill Hulagu and one of them's gonna try. And so I felt like you could have like the tagline, like the movie poster tagline could have been "Who
Yeah.
kills Hulagu" or something like that. So I really liked that because I spent the whole time being like, okay, someone's gonna attack him. When's it coming?
Someone's gonna try.
Yes. And I spent the whole trilogy feeling these complex emotions reading it because I do respect, the tactics and the
Yes.
impressiveness of the Mongol Empire, but you also see how much horrible stuff they did. And you see it not just from the Persians, and you don't just sympathize with the Persians, but you see it how it affects the other Mongols. In the book. And so talking specifically about Kokachin, her journey, without getting into spoilers for where she ends up in the trilogy,
Mm.
her journey seems the most connective to audiences, I think, because I think that they'll empathize with her.
Yes.
Was she the one that you were expecting to connect the most?
Not really. Some people have said to me they found themselves sympathizing with Hulagu Khan, which they felt a bit unclean about. But the fact they said, you made me care about him at times. I don't like that you've done this. I said, oh, good, my job has worked.
Right.
I've been successful. I think some readers would connect with her. I thought some would connect with Temujin, the fact that someone who isn't what they all wanted to be or isn't what their parents wanted to be or society, and they're trying to find their place. I thought some people would relate to that. And then I thought about with Kayvon, some people would say, you've been set up to be one thing and then it's taken away. Like a American football player who does really, really well and then get a terrible injury. And then
Hmm.
what do you do with the rest of your life when everything you've been training for your entire life up to that point is gone? How do you pivot? How do you become something else? So it's about transformation for all of these characters in some ways. Um, but I've had feedback from readers saying, "Oh, I like this one, I like that one." So it's different with every reader, I
Interesting.
think. Mm,
You did touch on the idea that there are people from outside this world that show up. For instance, you mentioned Marco Polo
hmm.
does make an appearance.
It
We have
does.
things like the papacy and the
Hmm.
clergy show up a little bit from Rome,
Yes.
and you also have the King of Georgia. So you when you were deciding how much to include, how did you decide when it was, oh, this is the right time to introduce this element from Europe? Because you could have just focused and made it just about Persia, but you
Yep.
expand it just enough that it feels really like you're seeing the total picture. How did you decide to include that?
It was thinking in terms of what Hulagu's trying to do. So at
Hmm.
that point, he's expanding further into Middle East. He's going to kind of towards Egypt, and the Mamluks are kind of powering up and coming against him. You've got Europe. Um, so I read lots of things around this. So there's actually a letter from, I think it's Hulagu Khan, but it's definitely one of the Khans, that they sent it to the Pope in Rome, essentially saying, and this is a real historical document, saying
Hmm.
basically the short version is we're coming soon. You should come here and on bended knee because it's inevitable that we'll conquer Rome and everything. And you're thinking, this actually happened. This is amazing. This was real. And so that was an interesting element because it created a conflict that even though it hasn't happened, it feels like it's coming down the line. In terms of Sicilian Armenia and Georgia and other countries around the Caucasus region, I thought I had to introduce them in some capacity because they're playing a role in terms of he needs their soldiers, he needs their skill, he needs their tactics to continue waging war in a way that he doesn't quite understand, but he's constantly learning. It's also historically true that there are a lot of Chinese and Persian engineers to help them because they understood mathematics at a level that was way beyond anybody else. Some people say mathematics came from the Middle East and other places, or chess came from all these sort of things you can argue over. I'll let historians debate that. But in terms of, so suddenly you've got all these, people think, oh, it's just Mongols on horses killing people all the time. It's not. You start realizing that they'd conquer a nation, but then they'd fold all of these things in. So they were constantly learning and adapting. And it's not really much of a spoiler to say that Kayvon realizes this is their strength. This is how they're able to conquer and grow so quickly, is that they learn with every nation that they conquer what their mistakes and things were, but what can they fold in? What can they improve on? How can they get better? So I avoided too many countries. I've only included certain kings and
Hmm.
princes like Prince Thoros and other ones, but I thought I needed a little bit of a flavor here and there to show you that it is a much bigger world. They go and go to the Golden Horde at one point
Hmm.
during the story, and in the front of the book there's a map. We're still not actually sure. Historians aren't sure where Sarai is, the city. So I just had to kind of guess and say, put it
Hmm.
there on the map. That'll do because there's no ruins now. It's gone. And we touch about on Egypt. So I kept thinking if I'd put too much in, this book will be 800 pages and it'll slow the pace
Yeah, we would
down.
have been
And then,
okay with that.
well, but then each book would have been 800 pages. And I'm thinking, oh God, that's a lot of information to process. And I think that's the danger sometimes that because I've learnt it, I think, oh, the reader needs to know all this. And unless it's interacting with the characters in that moment, you can get bogged down in too much detail.
Hmm.
Some of the feedback I've had from readers is they said, I enjoyed the first book. I now want to know what is accurate and what is not. I've become obsessed with knowing more about this element, and they've gone off and done their own research. And I'm thinking,
Hmm.
good. Well, at least that's an interesting spin. People are enjoying the books, and now want to say, well, what was the House of Strength real? And yeah, yes, it was. And people have gone and looked it up and stuff. So that's really
So
nice.
you talked about the 12 that are this group of basically like assassin spies that are kind of working in the shadows with
Mm,
the Persian people, and they employ quite a lot of different tactics. So they're not a they're not a one trick pony.
no.
How did you decide what to include with them in terms of how they would combat? Because sometimes they're combating Hulagu, but there's other times where they end up helping him out because the enemy of my enemy is my friend type thing. It's they end up having
Yes.
to protect the Mongols. How did you? I know that some of this is historical, but how did you decide which parts to include?
It's a case of so the idea of the 12 and the House of Grace came from the real historical elements of House of Strength, which exists, and it
Hmm.
still exists in some capacity to this day. It's a form of martial art, but also involves elements of philosophy and physical training and improving the body. And for the longest time, predominantly, it was a male space. But given that in history, we know that during the Mongol invasion and when they were away at war, many of the women were controlling and keeping the economy working and trade going to fund the war because they needed it. And so I kept thinking, there's always an equal and an opposite in something. And so the House of Strength, as they say, is the sort of the blunt force trauma. And I thought the House of Grace and the 12 are the subtle knife. And
Hmm.
so they employ various tactics. Assassination, they say, is always their last resort
Hmm.
because they prefer other things. Because if you kill someone, you can't then use them. You have to then get another contact. And so
Hmm.
it's their last resort. So they're essentially patriots and freedom fighters that work from the shadows because they're not allowed to own a business. They're not allowed to be seen to be running things, at least formally. Informally, we know it happened a lot. And so I just kind of built this idea of they're constantly there working in the shadows, working to piece together things to improve their country and to free it. But there again, they don't have an army. So what
Hmm.
techniques would you use? So every time I came up with something, I'd ask myself a question of, okay, but if you don't have an army, how does it work? What do you do? And so I then started pulling on real historical elements and thinking, yeah, but what if they were responsible? Or what if they got involved in that? How would they do it rather than just, blowing up the city and then moving on and killing everybody? What would they do? How would they manipulate people from the shadows? And so just over time, I kept adding elements to their kind of capacity and their skill set. But it was a long gestating process for them.
Yeah, and it just I really liked this concept of sometimes you have to like you have your ultimate goal, but sometimes you have to work with those you don't particularly like.
Yep.
Because this happens to Kokachin, especially in the third book, which we're talking
Hmm.
about this because the third book's out and we're not going to spoil it. But
Yep.
there's several points in the third book where Kokachin has to support and defend people that you would never expect her to support. Same with Kayvon and
Hmm.
even Temujin to an extent. And so it's interesting that their goal is to basically like free Persia
Yep.
from this Mongolian conquering, but at the same time, sometimes it's well, these Mongols over here are more dangerous. And so, how did you decide which Mongolian groups to include? Because, like you said, Kublai Khai's his group's not really present much, but say the
Nope.
Golden Horn shows up, or
Mhm.
Timur's group shows up, or a few of the others. So how did you decide which ones to include there?
History was always my guide. I
Okay.
just kept thinking about it. So we know that there were a number of civil wars around
Hmm.
this period in the Mongol Empire that caused even greater fractures. So I always had them in my mind. And when Kublai Khan became the Great Khan, that set off a number of different events in history that I was able to kind of keep in my back pocket and thinking, that's coming up, that's coming up. And I've had to shuffle certain events to make them more compressed.
Hmm.
But so like a battle might have taken 6 months before they conquered a city. I can't just
Right.
stop everything in the rest of the story for 6 months.
Right.
So I think the first book is set over 2 years, I think, or
Hmm.
maybe 3 years. I sort of have part one, two, and three. Um, but history kept ticking in the back of my mind, thinking, right, well, this civil war is coming up, and who's involved in that? Right, well, I'm going to have to show them because it affects what we're doing here. So when Hulagu wants more soldiers from Mongolia to help him, he calls on Kublai, but of course, there's something going on over there. So I have to kind of keep telling the readers, well, this was what's happening. This is why this can't help us now. I could have done the Game of Thrones thing and had 20 points of view, and then you have the story over there in Mongolia when they're trying to conquer southern China and then going to go into Japan. And I thought now it's just becoming too ungainly. I'm trying to keep the focus very much on this one place as much as possible. So I introduced information when it was absolutely necessary for other parts of the world and historically useful to what was happening.
Well, I'm just gonna say if you wanted to write those points of view in like another book, do another trilogy, I would totally read it
You
because
could just do it
I
the
was
other
loving
half.
it.
You could basically say, do it from Kublai's court, where suddenly he gets a letter
Yeah,
from Hulagu saying, "Send
exactly.
soldiers," and he's going, "Well, I
Yeah.
can't because this is going on," and then we tell that story. So
Oh,
a
that'd be so fun.
parallel trilogy. There you go. Rather than going forward in time, I could do a
Yeah.
parallel trilogy.
Oh, that'd be so much fun.
That's a lot of work.
I do want to ask you,
Yeah.
a lot of work. I do want to ask you about the cover design for this trilogy
Mm,
because it's really interesting. The
yes.
cover design here is not your typical fantasy design or historical fiction. It's got, these patterns that are either more like flowers or plants. So it's got this kind of Persian type of artwork
Hmm.
inspired elements, and it's got like the singular color in the background. And I know some people who like this style, and I know some people who don't like this style. So, from what you know, I don't know how integral you were in the process, but why did Angry Robot Books choose this style?
So I was involved in the design of all of the covers. Angry Robot gets all their authors involved early on. They sort of ask us for initial ideas. We pitch things. I send them like a Pinterest board with lots of pictures and that inspirations and
Mhm.
thoughts. They go away. They come up with a bunch of different ideas. We whittle it down to one or two, and then myself, my agent, my editor decide on which one we want to go for. The color was the most important thing. The rest of the elements were important too, but the color had to be right for this first book because it's a very particular kind of Persian aquamarine blue that's used in
Mhm.
a lot of temples, a lot of mosaics, a lot of pottery and artwork and glass. So that was very important. There's clues on the front of the book about the story. So there's the mandalas, which are obviously used in a lot of artwork. There's
Yeah.
fire symbols, there's flowers, there's the soldiers to indicate conquest. So it was, I basically threw all this stuff out at the designer, and her name's Sarah O'Flaherty, who did all three covers. And she came back with this, and I was absolutely amazed. I think from her first design to what we ended up with, we changed very little when she showed me this. And I just thought, this is brilliant. And we tweaked the text and things like that and the layout. But more or less, we sort of said, yeah, this feels of the period. It isn't a more traditional fantasy cover because the, so we call this historical fantasy. And every time I've spoken about the series, I've said it's predominantly historic led with a small element of magic. It's not the main thrust of the story. If you want that, I've got 6 novels with the word mage in the title. You want heavy magic? Go and read those. This time I'm doing something different. I'm focused on the politics, the assassinations, the secret societies, the war, the conquest, with a little bit of magic. And so having a cover that also looked very different, I think was important. So that if you have it next to I don't know, someone with a single figure on the front with a sword, you know exactly what you're getting with that. And with this one, it's going to be something a little bit different.
Well, it does make it feel a little bit more exotic, which I
Mm.
think helps considering the subject matter, because it's not like, the typical European style fantasy
No.
in any way, or even his European historical fiction. So that makes sense from the design perspective. This is not your only series with Angry Robot Books, and I wanted to give you
No.
a second to talk about another series you worked on with them, which is Duology, The Coward and the Warrior. So can you tell us what the pitch for that series is?
Yes. So The Coward and the Warrior are quest-based fantasy novels. I read many of them growing up as a young man, and I really loved them. And I
Mhm.
wanted to do something about that in that framework, but do something a little bit different with it. So The Coward was inspired by talking to and reading about soldiers who've gone to war. I spent time with a journalist who had actually spent 10 years as a reporter in the Balkan region when it was going through a lot of turmoil. And essentially, he came back with PTSD, as do many people who've been in the armed forces.
Mhm.
And so it's not just the soldiers, it's the doctors, the nurses, and the reporters. And so thinking about that, thinking about doing a quest-based fantasy novel, I thought, how could I make it feel more realistic in a way? So The Coward is about a young man that it's not the spoiler, this is kind of the setup for the book, that when he was 17, he sees all of the greatest heroes going on an adventure. The kings have summoned them. There's a danger in the north. they're going to go and vanquish it. And he's thinking, they're rich and famous, and everyone loves them. They've all got these lots of names and big horses and great armor. And so I want some of that. So he tags along with them against their wishes, essentially. But he does go with them. And over the course of this adventure, he watches all of the great heroes die in front of him. He is victorious, but he returns the kind of sole survivor. And he's broken utterly by this experience. Physically, he's mostly intact, but mentally, he's been destroyed by it and left a wreck of a man with PTSD. And the coward begins 10 years on after these events, where something in the north is stirring again. And the king was saying, well, you did it before. I think you should go and do it again. You did great last time. And of course, he really doesn't want to go again, but he still has questions. He still, because he's the sole survivor, he has doubts about what he actually saw because there's no one to corroborate what happened anymore. And he needs answers, but he's also still very, very against the idea. But over the course of the story, things happen. And he ends up gathering a new group of heroes and goes north. And so The Coward is very much a study of the nature of heroism, what it actually means. How do people overcome great difficulties? A study of someone with PTSD revisiting a war, essentially. So that's the kind of the Coward. The Warrior is a subsequent adventure with the same character. Years later, something else has happened, and he's required to go on a very different kind of a quest again with different people. But they're fairly self-contained, but there are threads that carry over in that duology.
And then do you have anything else you're working on that you can reveal or anything coming out that you can talk about?
Well, okay, so The Sorrow of the Sea was my 11th novel
Hmm.
in 10 years. I had two
Wow.
trilogies with Orbit to begin with, and a prequel novella. So I've got a standalone fantasy novel out with beta readers at the moment. And once that comes back, I'll be editing that, and that'll go to my agent. And as of today, I'm 4 chapters off finishing a long shot idea. I came up with something, pitched to my agent, and she said, that sounds really interesting. Go away and write that. So I've been writing that. Um, so when that's finished, I'll send it off to her as well. So then we have the waiting period of, is it sellable? Is it commercial? Who's going to buy it? What's going to happen? So there, those two things are going on. I'll also be self-publishing my second novella this year. I needed a complete palette cleanser, complete change. So I wrote a speculative, hard-boiled noir story called New York Minute, and it is about a downtrodden PI in alternate New York City trying to find a missing woman. And I really enjoyed that. It's about 42,000 words long, and I've got 2 more planned. So I'll be writing the second one of those fairly soon, and I'll self-publish that later this year.
Okay. And if people want to follow you online, where should they look?
The best places are I'm on Blue Sky or Instagram. I'm not on any other social media platforms. So you can contact me there. Also, I have a website and a monthly newsletter, so you can stay in contact with me on all my projects and updates if you want to. You can sign up via my website.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the channel today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.